Nature is a cold, cruel mistress, an unbridled force that cares little for the fears and opinions of humanity. The processes of the tides and the climate, the movement of landmass above and below the surface of the planet, the spin of the Earth and its revolution around our Sun, and of course, the process of evolution, do not care what we have to say about them, or the claims we make about them, or the ways in which we misconstrue or misunderstand them. These processes go on regardless, paying as little heed to us as we pay to the individual cells of our own bodies. The very nature of the universe has all the time of its existence, but none at all for our pithy questions of it. Nature has no emotional investment in our well-being, or even our existence. It will go on without us, perhaps even better off without us. This is just how nature operates, though. Completely indiscriminately, without prejudice. Humanity, on the other hand, is a thinking entity that is capable of cruelties that rival any natural process, by virtue of said cruelties carrying the weight of intention. Some might call that a natural process unto itself, being the result of a naturally intelligent species, using its natural capability to make choices that lead to the suffering of others and the same species, or even in other species. But most people just call that evil. The theory of evolution is not the work of just one man. It was pioneered by Charles Darwin, but it is the collaborative effort of many minds working together throughout the course of history. It is the collaborative effort of a lot of scientific experimentation, observation, modelling, and brainstorming by many. It is not an act of cruelty, but one of intense study and research. It's learning. It is a science, not an ideology. It explains how things are, not how they should be, or how we should strive to make them. Evolution is not Darwinism. In fact, evolution is not an ism, period. The source of social Darwinism was not Darwin, but Herbert Spencer and the tradition of Protestant nonconformism. You can look it up. Spencer's ideas of evolution were Lamarckian. The only real connection between Darwinism and social Darwinism is the name. And that's a whole bunch of facts that creationists across the internet consistently fail to understand. It never ceases to amaze me what pseudo-scientific garbage they'll concoct next, but linking evolution to Marxism, communism, or Nazism is quite possibly the most intellectually dishonest argument against evolution that I've ever encountered. According to proponents of creationism, Darwinism leads to social Darwinism, the policy that the weak should be allowed to fail and die. Or, as they like to word it, social Darwinism, the policy that the weak should be allowed to fail and die, comes logically out of Darwinism. The difference in wording here is basically playing rhetoric, like the difference between saying the bus stop's here at 5 p.m. and at 5 p.m. the bus will stop here. But the creationists' version includes a word that calls for careful analysis. The assertion that social Darwinism is the logical destination of Darwinism, which is really just the creationists' pejorative term for evolution, is a bold assertion, so we have to examine this claim with scrutiny and check the evidence provided. The first example is a lovely little anecdote by Raymond Hall, with no citations save for a couple of scripture references which are irrelevant to anyone but Christians, and far from academic. It is a longish article that you should feel free to read through in its entirety and determine the merits of his argument yourself, so I'll link it in the description below. But the crux of his assertions is made thusly.
Hitler's understanding of the history of life, and that of Marx, Stalin and Mao, was not devised by a German, Russian or Chinese. It was shaped by an Englishman named Charles Darwin. Darwin's book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life 1859, laid the groundwork for their worldviews. They each applied the principle of survival of the fittest to their own situation. For Marx and Stalin it was class struggle. For Hitler it was racial struggle. And because Darwinism undermined the authority of the Bible on origins, It meant that, logically, there was no accountability to God for the mass murder they used to implement their ideas. In fact, such tactics could be justified by Darwinism. Without an absolute standard of right and wrong, those in power are not accountable to any standard. So might becomes right. As Darwin's evolutionary thinking became widely welcomed and absorbed by society, it not only convinced leaders like Marx and Hitler, but it became a scientific framework justifying the public acceptance of their actions for the benefit of all humanity.
Of course, everybody knows that a good science denial position isn't good enough until it invokes Godwin's law. A term that originated on Usenet, Godwin's law states that as an online argument grows stronger and more heated, it becomes increasingly likely that somebody will bring up Adolf Hitler or the Nazis. When such an event occurs, the person guilty of invoking Godwin's law has effectively forfeited the argument. I think it's high time we adjusted that definition to include comparisons to communists and Marxists as well, since they all seem to get thrown into the same boat by the same people perpetuating the stupidity anyway. And we all know that the debate between creation and evolution has been raging on forever. What one side refuses to accept, though, is that there really is no debate. And until they realise that the positions that they're taking to create or invent the illusion of a debate are really without any kind of merit at all. But is this invoking Godwin's law? Is Raymond Hall's article invoking Godwin's law? Well, let's start with a couple of examples for comparison. Like just about every anti-science or science denial position, the comparison of scientific fact to evil is a common one. And these two examples, the first being used for fluoride denial in an argument on Facebook, and like everybody knows, when someone is wrong on the internet, you just have to say something. And the second one is a natural news article being used for vaccine denial. And I'll put a link to that in the description below, but that it does not come without a waiver. So I'm just wrapping up the editing of this video. I've just realised that the last sequence, I cut off the last word in the sound file by accident. It's supposed to be this link doesn't come without a waiver, but I've actually used the wrong word. It should be this link doesn't come without a disclaimer, and the disclaimer text was kind of shitty as well. It's kind of hard to read. Go easy on me. This is my first video ever, so yeah, next one will be better, I promise.
In its broader sense, it can be used to describe any situation where a poster loses all sense of proportion. For example, describing New Labour as ZANU Labour, after Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwean political party ZANU-PF. As well as the descriptive form, it can be used prescriptively. So if any poster does mention the Nazis in a discussion thread, and Godwin's law can be invoked, they instantly lose the argument and the thread can be ended. It is, in its simplest terms, a disproportionate reference to evil people that no one in their right mind would want to be associated with. In my experience, it tends to be more of a retaliatory attack, made to imbalance or upset the opponents in lieu of a superior argument, with facts and stuff. But, if this is done deliberately to end the argument, it does not apply. This codicil is known as Quirk's exception, and is one of two ways in which invoking Hitler does not constitute Godwin's law. The other way is when the argument has merit. For example, if our government or our society suddenly started rounding up gay people and putting them in camps to separate them from society or murder them off, a comparison to Nazi discrimination would not be without merit, in which case Godwin's law has not been invoked.
So does Raymond Hall's argument have any merit? Let's take a look at the arguments he makes. Now, as I've said, the link to the article is down below. And we'll trace the route of the logic that he seems to have taken to reach his conclusion that evolution somehow caused Nazism. The overall assertion here is that Hitler's understanding of the history of life and that of Marx Stalin and Mao was shaped by an Englishman named Charles Darwin. He goes on to state that they each applied the principle of survival of the fittest to their own situation. But what is survival of the fittest? Does it mean whoever is fitter, stronger, faster, and better in every natural and biological way should have more right to survival than someone who is weak and small, like me? If that's what Darwin meant by survival of the fittest, then yes, Hitler, Stalin, Marx and Mao could indeed be said to have been inspired by Charles Darwin. But back in the real world, that's not what he meant. Evolutionary theory shows us that the long-term survival of a species is strongly linked with its genetic variability. What happens is, a species with a better ability to adapt to its environments, being its fitness, will be more likely to survive, ergo survival of the fittest. Species with more genetic variability are more likely to survive than those with less. It has nothing at all to do with individuals or groups of the species asserting their dominance over other individuals or groups of the same species based on biological superiority. This is where the argument falls to pieces. They weren't applying the principle of survival of the fittest to their own situation at all, but rather they were applying their own interpretation of survival of the fittest to a moral rationalization of their evil deeds. But the result of social Darwinism would actually be the complete opposite of evolution, reducing humanity's genetic variability for the sake of purity. In fact, religiously based ideas of purity in Hitler's case, or outright control, and power, in the case of Stalin and Mao. Stalin, for example, didn't ban religion because he was an atheist. He banned it because it allowed the masses to gather and plot and connive against him. If you know your history, you know that Stalin reopened the churches during World War II in order to boost morale, giving his people the illusion that they had more freedom than they would under Hitler's reign.
All social Darwinist programs advocate minimizing genetic variability, thus reducing chances of long-term survival in the event of environmental change. Hitler, Stalin and Mao did not have the best interests of the species in mind. They had their own interests of the species in mind. Whether the misunderstanding of evolution was intentional or not, the science behind the theory of evolution was not the justification for the atrocities of these megalomaniacs. A proper education and understanding of evolution should then rebuke any attempt at social Darwinism if the long-term survival of humanity as a whole is treated as the goal. In fact, if Hitler, Stalin and Mao had had a proper education of evolution, perhaps they would have had no justification, no moral rationalization for the deeds they committed. According to Hall, Darwinism undermined the authority of the Bible on origins. But even pretending that evolution is the same thing as Darwinism, evolution has nothing to do with the origins of life, only the diversity of life. According to Hall, it meant that logically, and there's that word logically, there was no accountability to God for the mass murder they used to implement their ideas. And without an absolute standard of right and wrong, those in power are not accountable to any standard. The assumption here is that God is the absolute standard of right and wrong. But we've been over this before. One need only read Leviticus to see God's standard of right and wrong. And remember that Hitler, for one, was actually a Christian himself. And one can draw some pretty close parallels, at the risk of being accused of Godwin's law myself, between the genocides of the Bible and the genocides of Nazi Germany. The thing is, though, this is a real parallel. And if we were to apply the absolute moral standards of God of the Bible, we could use the Bible's example to justify genocide, slavery, murder, and a whole host of atrocities that simply cannot be justified by what Charles Darwin meant by survival of the fittest. This is what is called moral rationalization, where one essentially makes excuses to make doing evil deeds look like they're actually doing good deeds. And the problem with this is that they end up convincing themselves that they are righteous to the core because they can rationalize all the evil away. This is the core difference between social Darwinism and evolution. The former is ideological and subject to moral considerations of intentions. The latter is the explanation of a natural process, which is subject to the laws of nature, that indifferent force capable of killing men, women and children without prejudice, and subject not to the laws of God or man.
Do you know what else the Nazis were responsible for? It was the Nazis that pioneered spaceflight. Yep. Like it or not, we wouldn't be exploring space, we wouldn't have gone to Mars, we wouldn't have gone to the moon, if it weren't for those abominable malcontents, the Nazis. In June 1944, a Nazi test V-2 became the first man-made object to reach space. The first spacecraft and the ancestor of all launch vehicles. Does that make our astronauts Nazis? Does that mean that powered spaceflight will lead us back to Nazism? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not defending Nazis. This is just an example of how any culture, any civilization can be capable of good or evil, regardless of their faith or beliefs. Nazi technology has brought the world a long way. The problem with religion, though, specifically, is it enables moral rationalization, which we've looked at. And I'll link an article about it in the description as well. When one can excuse his evils with the excuse that God condones it, so it must be okay, that doesn't make him any less evil. It just means that's one more excuse that we have to take away from them. But I digress. Let's just review what we've learned for the moment. Hull equates the naturalistic idea of survival of the fittest to the ideological idea that might makes right. It's a really hard word to say if you're trying to say it fast. Just try it for a moment, see how you go. But because of this misinterpretation, intentional or not, he can create a chain of logic by which Hitler, Stalin and Mao somehow influenced the forces of nature for evil intent. If this were the case, though, and these three were indeed inspired by the works of Darwin, then they also misinterpreted the meaning and failed to understand the natural process of evolution. It's not something that is decided. It's not a choice made. People make a choice to dominate other people, to take over other cultures, to commit genocide and murder. Nature doesn't choose. Nature is indifferent. It's like water flowing from a high place to a low place. It just happens. It doesn't have any moral intention. It just goes. It just is. So a clarification needs to be made. Evolution is the natural process by which diversification of the species occurs, and not by which life originates. Social Darwinism, on the other hand, is an artificial and ideological process, I got it right that time, possibly inspired by a misunderstanding of Darwin's work, by which powerful people can justify their megalomaniacal position of might makes right. At this point on the topic of Godwin's law, I have to ask which one you think, out of the following two, is the most likely scenario. A. Evolution results in Nazism and social Darwinism. The natural process of evolution causes Nazism. It causes people to be evil. It causes the disruption of society. This natural process, this water flowing from a high place to a low place, causes people to be bad people. Or, choice B, that it's possible that Hitler's ideas for the genocide of the Jews were inspired by stories from the Bible. Similar acts from Leviticus and Exodus and Kings and Samuel. Which one is more likely? Seriously think about it. I know I'll get plenty of people making excuses and abusing me. But just think about it.
Humanity can learn a lot about nature, using the scientific method. But we can't change it unless we do learn about it. It's there, acting without will and against our own will. Nature has no intention, no morality, and no ethical boundaries. It kills, but it also creates. The most powerful forces of nature are mindless, and it is up to those with minds to get out of their way or prepare for their effects. We study nature because it can tell us a lot about ourselves and improve our chances for survival. In this way, we can mindfully participate in the process of evolution by keeping our species as fit as possible, as a whole, by utilizing science to advance technology, engineering, medicine, and mathematics. We not only improve our own chances of survival, but we make ourselves the caretakers of other species on this planet, and by our own fitness, we can help them survive as well. By keeping the entire ecosystem of our planet as stable as possible, we improve our chances of survival tremendously. As it turns out, our fitness as a species relies on the fitness of many other species in that ecosystem as well. And it's through science and learning about evolution and all other natural processes that we know this. Not any wisdom imparted upon us by the Bible, else we would have known not to hunt other species to near or total extinction in the past, because the Bible would have told us not to. Instead, the Bible tells us to kill, to enslave, to exclude, to subvert. There are some good things in the Bible. It does teach some wisdom, but it also teaches a lot of hate. And it's the hate that we can do without.